everyone to week 3 of the Open Data Policy Lab City Incubator Data Innovation Bootcamp, Planning Best Practices. And so for today, as you can see, we're at the 3rd session of our 6-week Data Innovation Bootcamp. 3 more to go after today. You guys have been doing great. And the focus for today is, now that we've gone over foundations, inclusive innovation, we're going to be diving more into the data innovation lifecycle, really turning our focus on how to effectively plan for data innovation, keeping in mind the agile nature of this work. So hopefully you'll come out of today with a few tools, but also just kind of ideas to continue to keep in mind as you're all in different phases of your work, but some of you are still kind of in the planning phase. And I think no matter where you are in your data innovation, you should hopefully have some nice takeaways from today. So we'll be kicking off today with Stefaan and Andrew going over ensuring transparency, accountability, and monitoring decision provenance across the data lifecycle. Tyler Kleykamp from the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation will be joining us then to go over talent and expertise to consider. The key component of all of your work are the people that you have access to and your teams. And then we're joined by the Mastercard City Possible team today. So both Michael and Alby, I see that you've joined. Thank you so much. They're partners in this program. And going to be sharing more about tools that you all will have access to as a part of the City Incubator program. So really thrilled to have them here today. And as always, we'll wrap up the session with a short exercise and a facilitated discussion. And so with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Andrew and Stefaan to go ahead and take us through the first part of today's program.
Great, thanks so much, Adrian. I will share my screen here. Great, hopefully you can see my screen.
All good.
Oh, great. So as Adrian indicated, our focus for today is really thinking about transparency and monitoring decision processes across the data lifecycle. So I know that Stefaan had touched a little bit in week 1 on this concept of moving from data intelligence to decision intelligence, but we'll start out by having a little bit more of a discussion on that front and then get into some practices and examples of how folks are going about monitoring that issue of decision provenance across the data lifecycle. And we'll dive into a few ways to think about that in a moment. But Stefaan, I don't know if you wanted to kick off this focus on the decision intelligence portion of the...
No, thanks, and great seeing you all. Hope you had a wonderful weekend. And so I think one of the key challenges that we constantly hear when it comes to data innovation is twofold. One is, how do we make sure that the insights that are being generated are translated into decisions, right? Because ultimately impact, as you all know, and that was something that we discussed, I guess, in week 1, is that ultimately we are all working towards generating impact from data. And that means that we need to start thinking in a 2-step approach, i.e. how do we go from data to insight, but then more importantly, from insight to decision. So that's the first challenge that we constantly hear, is how do we actually make this happen? And how do we start thinking about that in somewhat of a more conceptual way to then subsequently make it actionable? And the second element is then not only, because that's a different kind of discussion, but not only how do we turn data to decision, but how do we make sure that decisions that are made across the data lifecycle are responsible, accountable, and transparent, so that we not only do this in a actionable way, but also do it in a responsible way. And those are two kind of different approaches, but I think it's important to anyway approach them perhaps together. Now, as it relates to from insight to decisions, given the fact that we are all working here within a context of policy making, public service design, or the problem solving. Next slide, Andrew. I think it's important to really clear the cloud of decisions indeed, next slide, which is the whole idea of data, is to not just look into where the light shines, but also to become more illuminated by actually other drivers and approaches. But I think it's important to start thinking about, if you are developing a data innovation initiative, what decision, right, across the decision lifecycle of policymakers are you actually seeking to inform? Because that's quite often not that well established, or not even considered when designing certain kinds of data innovations. And I think it's important to take a step back and say, well, policymaking or public service design or problem solving is not one act, right? It involves a whole range of decisions, quite often by different people, quite often in different contexts, and quite often with different needs. And so when you start thinking about, well, we seek to use insight to inform decisions that can inform the options on how to move forward, because decisions is basically nothing more complicated than being able to decide what option to move forward, right? And based upon what information do you make decisions with regard to the options as policymakers to actually move forward? And this could be not just one option, but a variety of options. I think it's important to think about what element of the decision lifecycle do you seek to inform? Is it at the moment when you start defining the issue, which is quite often about, agenda setting? It's quite often about trying to understand what is the problem that we seek to solve, and that's where data can obviously play a role. Or is it at the moment when you, try to establish criteria with regard to which ones to prioritize, and how do you inform what problem to prioritize moving forward? Is it at the ideation stage where you try to, come up with solutions and where data can play a role? Is it about, ultimately implementation? Or is it about evaluation of whether the decision and the policy, the public service has made a difference? Now, obviously, what we present here is a very simplistic kind of approach to think about perhaps the decision lifecycle when making decisions that can inform the public interest. But you can develop your own, with regard to the topic, you can develop within your own organization, how are actually decisions made, right? Who defines the agenda? How do we inform the agenda setting? How do we inform the prioritization? How do we inform ultimately the implementation and ideation with regard to the prioritized problem? And how do we then ultimately start evaluating whether any of that made a difference? Data plays a role at each of those stages. And it's important to think about, what insight do you seek to develop that informs what decision-making, and more importantly, who across that data lifecycle should be informed with regard to the data that the insight that one seeks to establish. So that's the first big kind of, if we talk about, this is the theory session. Now, somehow Andrew and I are always at the theory session, Adrian. But if this is the theory session, that's the first conceptual element with regard to decision-making, perhaps, that you can start using in your further development of the data innovation. Next slide, Andrew. You want to talk about this? I think we addressed that basically throughout the thing, right? So why don't we go next? Because I want to just plant a few. Next slide. That's over to you now. So Great. The second is really about who makes decisions across the data lifecycle. So we have two life cycles here. We have the decision lifecycle, and then we have the data lifecycle. And decisions can be informed across the decision lifecycle, but decisions are made across the data lifecycle to inform those decisions. And that also requires a dedicated conceptual deconstruction in order to understand more transparency and accountability. So that's the second big idea that we hope to share today. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Stefaan. And exactly, so the second component is really focused on this issue of decision provenance and tracking those and monitoring and making transparent and accessible to other stakeholders, what those decision-making processes look like across the data lifecycle and who is involved in them. So this decision provenance mapping approach that we'll discuss here in the next few minutes is a way to really design and assess data innovations in a way that clarifies and identifies where those decision points lie and which internal and external parties are influencing those decision points at different stages of the data lifecycle. And what we found is often this kind of articulation and accessible type of monitoring and mapping of the decision-making processes and flows can help to pinpoint gaps in current process, better harness and create value from data assets that are being shared, and also, especially from a data responsibility perspective, identify areas that might have certain risks or unmet opportunities associated with them. So of monitoring and clarifying the decision-making, the decision provenance, we focus especially on where we stand at each point of the data lifecycle, from initial, even before this graphic here, getting into the planning section, data innovation or investment, through the collecting stage, processing and storage stage, sharing stage, analyzing stage, and eventual using or reusing stage. There are obviously a number of different activities and decision points that are taken to enable progress toward eventual goals for the data innovation, whether it be a data system being deployed, a certain type of policy being generated, or other uses of data that we have a broad array within this cohort here today. And then the other component that we kind of bring into this assessment of activities across the data lifecycle is something that many of you might be familiar with, this concept of a Racy Matrix. So in other words, identifying which parties are responsible, accountable, consulted, or should be informed about different activities at each stage of the data lifecycle. And so in our context, when we think about who is responsible for a particular activity, we think especially about the parties that are tasked with actually carrying out that activity. So this could be individuals or teams that have a particular mandate to execute specific tasks, and they are responsible for those tasks, which is distinct from the concept of who is accountable for those activities. So who's liable for the success, failure, or unintended consequences of a given activity, as opposed to the execution, which is more of the responsible kind of component. Then obviously the issues around who should be consulted, who needs to have a voice in the decision-making processes that go into these different activities, who should be consulted at different stages. And then finally, who just needs to be informed, who needs to be kept up to speed on different practices across the data lifecycle. And having that type of assessment can be really valuable in identifying where those gaps and opportunities might lie to improve certain processes from an operational perspective, as well as a data responsibility one. So this might be a bit hard to read on your screen, but what we have here is our decision provenance mapping tool or methodology, meant to be as kind of simple as possible in terms of a framework, so that it's really kind of valuable as almost a checklist or something that can be used as part of a team to monitor where those decision-making processes lie and who's accountable, responsible, needs to be consulted, and who should be informed across them. So what we have here, and this is something that we can share with the group as well, is this kind of worksheet where at each of those stages of the data lifecycle, you can actually outline which activities are taking place, where those decision points lie, and then outline across that Racy matrix, who are the parties that fit into each of those kind of persona or types of role as it relates to each activity. And then finally, importantly, we have the box at the bottom to really focus on what institutional policies, applicable laws, or other elements of the policy ecosystem might impact how those decisions are being made, so that as kind of an overarching question can be assessed as part of this monitoring and evaluation process of decisions made across the data lifecycle. And we have another example and a few questions, but Stefaan, did you have anything to add on the methodology itself?
No, I think it's just, anyway, at a certain point in time, we felt that really when it involves multi-party kind of data sharing or multi-party kind of data initiatives, that it's really important to get clarity on who actually makes decisions across the data lifecycle, not just from a perspective of accountability, but also a perspective of actually operational clarity on actually, who are you waiting for or who should be involved, and how do we make sure that decisions are indeed done as a result of consultation by those that need to be consulted. And that could be, for instance, the public at large at certain points in time, right? Which is something that, as you know, we've done with regard to the data assembly and acquiring a social license. So you could say, well, at what point in time do you actually need to go back and get some kind of a social license to actually do what you are proposing to do? So that's the reason why we developed the decision provenance in addition to the data provenance, which is kind of well established, trying to understand your lineage of where your data came from. But of course, data is a result of someone making a decision to collect the data, someone making a decision to store it in certain kind of environment, and someone ultimately analyzing to answer a question that then subsequently can inform the decision lifecycle. And I think it's important to at least have clarity about this. And each time we've done this now in a variety of organizations, and it's not easy to do, right? Which is a reason why I think it's important to at least have a more proactive understanding on actually who is responsible, who is accountable, and should be informed moving forward, because that will then make sure that there is no backlash at a certain point in time, but also will inform that you can report back to the responsible individuals that are responsible or accountable on how things have evolved over time. And I think that's why decision provenance will become more important from my point of view, in addition to data provenance as well, because it allows for that kind of level of transparency and accountability. Just knowing that someone is accountable already instigates accountability quite often.
Great. And then, so just as another way to think about this, we talked about decision provenance and ways to map that out. This is one example from a project that we've been involved with over the last few months in establishing a governance framework for a geographical data trust. This is a way to actually map out those decision-making processes in more of a workflow or decision flow type of model to really outline what are the stages that go involved and what are the different decision points and branching kind of elements of a decision tree almost that play a role in how a data innovation is actually, both from an operational and a governance perspective, how those decisions are being made and what those different options are at different stages of the life cycle. So this is another model that can be used kind of in a complementary way with the type of mapping that we just discussed to really get into what is that process flow from a decision-making perspective.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize it's not remarkable, but it is a fact that we quite often don't map the flows of the business processes or the decision processes that ultimately instigate certain kind of action. And I think trying to do that is always illuminating. Quite often because it happens by accident quite often, and there's no clear understanding on why it is that way and why it should remain that way. And so doing this kind of mapping is always a useful exercise. But then also, we use this together with Place here in order to identify trigger points with regard to when actually should a decision be made or who should be alerted when we are in that stage, right? And how do we make sure that we then have adequate governance discussions and decisions across the business process, or in this case, the decision process, to leverage drone mapping data and make this accessible for others. And doing that kind of, and this doesn't have to be complicated, right? But doing this kind of understanding of the business process is always a useful exercise, and you can embed decision provenance in that context, and that's why we shared this with you. Anyway, a lot of this is probably already known, but I think just as a reminder, that there are different decisions across the decision lifecycle that data can inform, and it's important to try to be clear, anyway, what stage of the decision cycle do you want your insight to be shared? And it could be the full cycle, but I think it quite often involves different people, different kinds of insight. And two, there are decisions made towards generating the insight across the data lifecycle. And I think it's also important to understand that this is not happening by happenstance. People make decisions on how this ultimately will be done. And it's good to at least know what was the rationale, and who ultimately will be accountable down the line. I think is a good practice to have as well. With that, Andrew, I think we are done with our session here.
We have just a few quick questions I'll just put on the table briefly that are potentially worth considering upon completion of this kind of mapping. So just given that better understanding of the decision provenance and where gaps might exist, it can be useful to think about, are the roles and mandates clearly defined and well understood among relevant parties? Is the decision flow sufficiently transparent between these stakeholders? Does everyone know who's doing what? Are there clear communication channels, or are there certain bottlenecks or information silos that should be addressed based on that type of mapping or overview of the decision flow? Are these processes adequately captured by knowledge management systems? And then are there regular reviews of these decision-making processes, as well as any relevant implications of an evolving policy landscape to ensure that that approach remains the most optimal over time as it relates to decision-making? So those are just some things that might be worth considering when going about this type of decision provenance, but that is it from our end.
Pleasure to introduce you to this group. Tyler Kleykamp was the first Chief Data Officer of the state of Connecticut and is currently a director at the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, the creator of Data Ops for Government Framework, along with a lot of other things. And I'm happy to let him elaborate. But otherwise, Tyler, the floor is yours, and you're welcome to share your screen and go ahead.
Great. Thank you all for having me, and yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all a little bit today. So I think what I'm here to talk about is sort of how you build out a team around a data project. And I think really sort of my perspective on this is, having run several data projects, primarily at the state level, and taking away some of my lessons learned from people that weren't engaged in sort of the project, which is a term I'd actually encourage you not to use, and to think about this as a process that is ongoing and that can be continuously improved. And so I think one of the things we learned by going through certain things in Connecticut was, ultimately, we were so focused on the data skill sets and things of that nature that we forgot about a lot of the other people that are engaged in what I would refer to as sort of the data pipeline, for lack of a better term. And the other piece that sort of came to mind a lot, or one of the biggest sources of friction, is when an issue arose where maybe somebody hadn't been included as part of our conversation or our process or our work, we were engaging with them over email primarily. And so much can get lost in email communication. Things get misinterpreted. People who may not be sort of as technologically savvy as others don't always sort of understand things. So a few of the things that we learned were, one, you really need to sort of take a step back from things and think about the sources of data that you're going to be working with and where they're coming from. So the sort of first members of your team should actually be somebody or someone who's actually directly engaged with collecting that data. So if you're working with, let's say, administrative data, that should be someone who is a caseworker or somebody who works out in the field that's really collecting that data or responsible for the delivery of the service, where maybe it's the actual client that's entering that data. And why is that? Well, metadata is great. Data dictionaries are great. We can document all of our data sources as much as we want, but we had an event in my day-to-day work where one of the speakers came in, and this quote just resonated with me, which is basically a lot of the data that we collect represents people, but it doesn't represent the whole person, right? So we only know a slice about each individual that is captured in a data system, whereas the people who are really working on the front lines often understand a lot of the nuance around it. And then I'll share sort of another example. I think my recollection was this was our state unemployment insurance system. So if you think about a lot of these legacy systems that exist, especially in government, they don't respond well to changing needs. So if you look at, say, an unemployment insurance system, it's, can be 40 years old. We've all heard the, New Jersey governor begging for COBOL developers and that type of thing. One of the things we found was we were doing some research and found we had a lot of people who were identified as speaking German, which is sort of a disproportionate share of people than we would have expected to speak German as their primary language in Connecticut. As we dug through this and started talking to the subject matter experts in that, basically there's no reason to collect language on an unemployment insurance application, and so they were flagging languages to mean something totally different, another piece of information that they were trying to collect. So German maybe meant they were participating in a SNAP employment and training program. And so these things don't often get documented in these systems. So that's why, number one, it's so critical to involve those people so that you can really understand a lot of the data that you're working with. So that's one piece. The other thing to keep in mind are all the different people that are touching data along the way, because ultimately, when you're trying to pull together data from disparate systems, you're asking somebody else to do something in addition to their day-to-day work. So those might be, the IT staff that just manage those databases or things like that that are generating reports. And, you're asking them to do data pulls on some periodic basis. So you need to understand what their existing sort of workflow is, what their existing workload is. And ultimately, they need to be engaged in that process so that they can understand, that this isn't just another thing they're being asked to do, but it has some broader purpose down the road. So it's really about engaging them and letting them know that they're part of, answering these big, complicated questions, and that they're sort of a critical part of that process. The other people that I think tend to get left out in some of these conversations are the actual decision makers at the end of the road, right? So just as a sort of story, a couple weeks into being chief data officer in Connecticut, my boss, who was the secretary of the budget office, was interested in some work around, different sources of revenue and things like that, and wanted to have some insight into some better insight into some financial issues. And I said, oh, that's great. We can build a dashboard and do this thing for you. And his response was, no, I'm not going to come in every morning and look at a dashboard and check these things. That's what I have you for. I want to be able to pick up the phone, right, and call someone and have them answer that question for me. So, right, but you need to know you need to have that information, right, from the person who's really looking to answer those questions. Then you need to go back that step and say, okay, who is that person that, if that's their goal, to pick up a phone and call someone, who is that? So it's really making sure that the end users are engaged in that, so that you're really kind of connecting both ends of the spectrum here so that sort of everybody kind of understands what the game plan is. You know, that person who might be being asked to do something differently at the point of capture of data understands that it's because the person all the way at the other end of this data pipeline is, you know, has this need, and that they're part of that team. So we've kind of talked about maybe some of the non-data players. The third piece that I would just say, and that I need to update my framework that I've been working on, is an attorney, right? So you may need to have some type of legal agreements in place, and then sort of going to that attorney after you've scoped out your project and you have this idea in mind, is probably too late, because they could very easily say, you know what, this isn't a legal use of this data. So now your project's kind of blown up. So I think the idea is to sort of pull all these people together, get them in a room or a virtual Zoom room, right? So that everybody's really on the same page in terms of what the goals and objectives are. And then that's when you can really start to focus on what I would say are, you know, more of the technologists that will be involved, or the sort of data people. And when you think about that, I would just encourage you to, you know, again, go back, and I know you're doing some work to sort of scout out the different data sources. So it's really ensuring that all the people that are touching those different systems are sort of plugged into that process, which will then help you sort of define, like, what actual skills do you need? Because you may have, you know, somebody who works out of this agency who's very capable of pulling data out of one system, but another agency lacks that. So there becomes that opportunity to, right, just share that expertise across those domains. The other, I think, aspect that I think is really critical, especially when we're talking about city level data projects, are somebody from the GIS team. They're, right, people who, most of these things exist in location, and I guarantee you there's somebody in your GIS, your mapping department, who's like just dying to get involved in a project, frankly. They often feel like they just do, like, they're the nerds in the corner. I was one of them at one point in time, that just make maps. And so I think a lot of them are really hungry to get out of, like, this niche perception of what they do, and bring their expertise to bear in those other places. And then finally, the other thing that I always found helpful in these is just somebody who is not actually engaged directly with the data or the programs themselves. So that may be, I don't know, like, your transportation, you know, data manager who doesn't necessarily work in, like, health and human service type of functions. They tend to bring one sort of a neutral perspective to things, have the ability to, you know, kind of put their ego aside and be a little bit of less of a worrying about their own individual turf. It can be harder to pull those people in when they don't necessarily see the value of their day-to-day work. But I always look at it as somebody who's not specifically engaged with the data or the programs that individuals are working with, but often have some experience in whether it's service delivery or something of that nature, just as like another sort of neutral voice that's in the room, that can help sort of suss out, you know, the turf issues or the ego issues that may be involved in those. So I'm just going to pause there.
But I'm happy to introduce next our partners at Mastercard City Possible. So Michael, Director of Enterprise Partnerships, and Alby, VP of Global City Partnerships, and a former colleague of mine at the New York City CTO's office, who'll be sharing a little bit again about tools available, and potentially also building off of the conversation that you've been hearing this morning. So welcome you to share your screen if you'd like, but otherwise the floor is yours.
Thanks, Adrian. So I'll just be super quick because the one with the real information here is Michael. I wanted to just take an opportunity just to share a little bit about, just to kind of frame out like what we do at City Possible and why this stuff is important to us. So currently, a lot of folks always kind of ask the question of why Mastercard is interested in cities, or why City Possible even exists. And so, really, this is our effort to facilitate a community of practice and a co-creation framework for cities. And so since its inception a couple of years back, it started off with about 18 cities, and now we've grown to about 305 cities. And the idea is just to create this global community to kind of address common challenges, share best practices, and really just kind of build this thought leadership community, right? Like we, as a former municipal executive, as you might know, sometimes the challenge is connecting with other cities and learning from each other and being able to co-facilitate some of these difficult discussions. And so we've built that community, so it's grown. And one of the benefits of when cities, which by the way is at no cost to them, one of the benefits is we kind of unlock a suite of solutions that we have. A lot of them are data focused around a bunch of different topics. Some of them are around sentiment analysis that they can get. Obviously, we're a payments company, and so we unlock our transaction data and financial data that cities can really kind of collect and realize what the economic impact of any decision is. So we've been talking a lot about gathering all the right information and making sure that you engage the right stakeholders, et cetera. And so for a lot of this stuff, cities want to understand what the financial impact is on a decision. And so we're able to unlock that along with just a suite of solutions that Michael's going to talk about. But again, I think that more than anything that we created this community to just ensure that we're supporting cities with a lot of what their pressing challenges are, which we find are very common. And so, this shared community has really taken off. We're having a lot of convenings and a lot of gatherings and such. And so now it's just a matter of sharing all of our tools with cities. And so that's kind of what we're doing now. I'll let Michael kind of take it away and kind of walk you through what that looks like. But yeah, excited to be participating with all of you and excited to be working with you again, Adrian.
Great. Thanks, Alby. Appreciate it. And thanks all for the time. I'm going to start sharing my screen, but I think that Alby really summarized it really well with the goal of the things that I'm going to show around City Insights and the tools that we are making available to you, but that City Possible members have more broadly available. And as part of this cohort and our partnership with the City Incubator, we thought that it's interesting tools to sort of potentially get access depending on your project and your data challenges and data innovation challenges. In particularly, as we're talking today around planning, it is really goes line in line with a lot of the things that we're thinking, and a lot of the ways that we use our data and our partners to help you in that. So I'm showing here the citypossible.com website, and I'll sign in into my account to show the City Insights. But essentially, if you eventually wanted to get access to this tool, you would join sort of the community, let's say, or join the community, and we would make those available to you, the access to the tools itself, which are exclusive to City Possible members. So just to flag that they're not open to anyone that sort of goes on the site, but so just to keep it in mind. So when you're logged in, signed in, we give you access sort of to these tools. This is when you find it under My Resources, Mastercard City Insights. It would have a button to say Request Access, which I would get, and knowing who you are and your names, I'll be able to sort of approve it. But essentially, this is the meat of what I wanted to share. We created City Insights as a way to sort of localize, centralize, curate a great number of analytical and data tools and programs and resources for our cities, and giving them exclusive access to some of these data tools to be able to sort of plan and understand better the health, the social health, and the economic health of their communities. So these are around different themes, around cybersecurity, around data and insights, around program measurement, small business, and different areas of where we've seen a lot of interest from our cities. But I'm gonna showcase a little bit of like our specific data tools itself that we have here. So for example, Sense City is a partner of ours. They provide sentiment analysis and essentially transform sentiment analysis that happens online, digital discourse that happens online, and provide that information to make effective and efficient decision making, right? So things around potentially an infrastructure project or a transit project, or in general, sort of like how is your community feeling about a COVID restriction? So that's a lot of like things that are running for our members right now, COVID and mask mandates or vaccine hesitancy, etc. But they're providing for you a free custom sentiment report of your choosing. Essentially, you know, as you go here, you click on Get Started, you're able to sort of request your report right away, and they'll connect with you directly to on a topic of choosing, which can be one of these or any of that you may want. So this is one resource that we find very interesting as you're planning of your data challenges as well, to understand what is the input from your communities on the things that you're thinking about. Could be sort of very, very interesting to think about. So other ones, this is another one from Mastercard that a lot of cities have really found a lot of use for. This is called Geographic Insights, and essentially is really taking the Mastercard transaction data, mapping it on a map, let's say, right, and in a heat map specifically, and you can go down to sort of a block level to understand the economic impact on a time period of a particular perhaps economic or policy decision that may have been done, or impact to small business. New York City, for example, used it for calculating or anticipating potential sales tax revenue in the midst of COVID. So there's like a number of use cases that have been utilized here to understand sort of the economic impact to communities based on the power of the aggregated and anonymized power of the Mastercard data. And where this is also a resource that we're making available for you all. Similarly, there's other partners here. I know I would run out of time if I showed you all of them, but Spending Pulse and other Mastercard tools that you would have access. This is US only at the time, but it provides similar sort of things that I mentioned on Geographic Insights, but it also provides not only Mastercard data, but it's looking at cash, is looking at online spend. So it's not just looking at the physical retail spend, but at the broader sort of economic impact of particular, again, policy or program decisions that may be made, or impacts of an event that may have in a particular geography. So again, great sort of tools from a decision of economic decisions that you may be thinking about. And then we have other partners like Bright Cities that is looking at and offering a diagnosis report of your city across 11 different performance areas, 10 performance areas, sorry, governance, education, health. So, you know, I guess you could choose one of those areas and deep dive with Bright Cities to understand, based on their sort of model and their standards, how does your city map in the context of other cities in a particular sort of performance area of focus. So many other things in here that I would love to, of course, to talk to you more about, to those that may find value in them, or that as you sort of explore the site, you are more than welcome to reach out to myself and Alby as partners of the City Incubator. And we are, happy to sort of connect to further resources that may see fit as you go through your planning and your exercise for your data challenges.